This presentation is going to be very international in nature because the professor has Italian surname but works at a British university. Is going to talk about German and French topics.
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be back in Krakow after a number of years because of my change of my institution, life, pandemic, whatever happened in these 7 years I'm missing. And again, thank you for having me. One of the most fertile aspects in the investigation of the relationship between architecture and the city is how tradition and innovation influence the urban context in their intertwining, overlapping, and even in their opposition. The city, in fact, is a repository of science and materials that endure and upon which the intervention of the new is grafted in a succession of human actions and traces that mold the urban environment in layers and juxtapositions. In particular, the question of dualing offers an opportunity to examine how this theme has been interpreted in the attempt to construct the human environment in the necessary creative continuity to respond to the demands of life and the aesthetic needs of humans as they vary and persist over time. In the context of a reflection on the architecture and the city, and considering the dualing as the primal constituent element of this relationship, we can recognize certain forms of dualing that can be found consistently in European cities: the linear block and the courtyard building types. The direct relationship of the linear block building with the street and the other public spaces, such as the square, the park, the garden, is one of the most peculiar aspects that construct the residence and at the same time structure the city. We could recognize the origin of this configuration in the linear portico structure of the Greek city Stoa and Roman city Forum, where the repeated and serial element of the colonnade precisely configures a public and semi-private space at the same time, both open and protected. This kind of relationship is evident in the development of the traditional urban fabric of the European city. Similarly, the memory of traditional spatial configurations can be found in the architecture of courtyard building types. As an illustrative example, Palladio's palaces in Vicenza, with their open-air atriums, can be interpreted as a monumental reinterpretation of the Roman courtyard house. But not only. Giorgio Grassi and Aldo Rossi, for instance, have emphasized how the model for this urban building type can be found in rural houses and collective structures, such as convents, schools, hospitals, whether located in urban or rural areas. With the crisis of the 19th century city, the building types and urban configuration of the traditional city needed to be challenged. The critique of the corridor street was the key aspect in Le Corbusier's idea of renovation of city planning. The Swiss master in the 1920s noted how the city has become a congestion of buildings that grow greater, interlaced by narrow streets full of noise, petrol fumes and dust, a picture of the seventh circle of Dante's Inferno. This is, of course, Le Corbusier words, in which the fabric of the traditional city, though fascinating in its picturesque aspect, was where, quote, tuberculosis, demoralization, misery, and shame are doing the devil's work among them. The street, according to the narrative of Le Corbusier and the other modern movement thinkers, was no longer the harmonious construction of public space and architecture based on human scale and perception, but a dangerous and unhealthy place, poorly lit, noisy, defined by insalubrious traditional residential blocks. In this context, the masters of modern movement turned towards a series of responses to the problem of housing and city construction, which, despite the apparent rupture, we can actually see as an interesting reference to tradition. In the 1920s, German architects and planners developed the settlement typologies of the Siedlungen. the use of geometrical grids and patterns, the orientation following the heliothermic axis, and the renewed relationship with nature, private and collective gardens, parks, almost represent a recovery of the historical principle underlying the origins of town planning and the design of cities. The linear block, a recurrent residential building type in its different variations, would be recognized by the modern movement designers as a natural and virtuous evolution of the urban blocks of the historic city, as May and Pagano argued. All of this is evident in the Italian context in the 1938 project for Milano Verde, Green Milan, proposed by Franco Albini, Ignazio Gardella, Giuseppe Pagano, and others. The project for the area Sampione Fiera in Milan applies to the existing fabric a rigid Cartesian grid that has been defined as abstract for its unconditional and pure geometry, but as noted by Raffaella Neri, it is abstract, quote, in the sense of general, of universal, abstract and geometric, because it's demonstrative, because its geometric order contains and displays an idea of architecture, an idea of a city, end of quote. And after all, it has the same virtuous abstraction represented by the long thread that connects the Podamus grid of the Greek city and the Roman Centuriazio that designed the Italian landscape to the Renaissance ideal city, up to the urbanization of the American continent. The courtyard type, transfiguration of the courtyard house or the cloister, and the linear block type, reinvention of the portico, the forum and the stoa, show the continuity of memory, history, and tradition in the architectural and urban devices that allow the construction of the city. My paper, included in the book, focuses in two emblematic precedents of this reflection, both designed in the mid-1920s, represent the trajectory between tradition and invention in the architecture of dueling at the urban scale and at the architectural scale. Le Corbusier project for the Immeuble Villa, the monumental courtyard building that represents his tendency of embodying in his work traditional types and architectural elements, the modernist reinvention of the urban fabric as a composition of linear blocks in Mart Stam's Hellerhof Siedlung in Frankfurt. But today, I will discuss only the theme of the linear residential block and its reinventions between Germany and Italy in the 30s, 50s, and 70s. The Hellerhof Siedlung was designed by Mart Stam in the context of the Das Neue Frankfurt program directed by Ernst May. The project was presented in 1929 at the CIAM in Frankfurt, titled Housing for the Existence Minimum, and later published in the issue number 4 or 5 of 1930, year 1930 of the journal Das Neue Frankfurt, which was entirely dedicated to 5 years of planning and developments in the German city. The layout of the project is related to the final phase of the evolution of the urban block in the European city, as described by Ernst May in the famous diagram depicting the transformation of the traditional compact block into a system of enclosed courtyard buildings and then into a system of parallel linear buildings that construct a more open new city, which Mart Stam evoked in 1923. Quote, medieval cities were enclosed by walls, so their main characteristic became self-containment and compactness. Modern cities, on the other hand, open up towards the outside. End of quote. The Hellerhof Siedlung belongs to the third type expressed in May's diagram that corresponds to a system composed of linear residential blocks with open spaces in between, arranged in a north-south orientation. The majority of Frankfurt Siedlungen were built according to this organization, including Romerstadt, Praunheim, and Ritterwald. This new relationship with the street, the dismantling of compact front of the street corridor, the study of residential types, and the rediscovery relationship with the natural elements, green spaces, which become common assets and tools for city design, as well as orientation relative to the helothermic axis, are the cornerstones of the modern movement to search for an alternative to the traditional city. The intervention includes 800 apartments distributed across a series of linear buildings of varying heights, some of which exceed 160 meters in length. There are two-story buildings oriented east-west, served by a balcony, 4 three-story buildings, and 1 four-story building oriented north-south. The buildings are spaced approximately 25 meters apart. The apartments have different typological layouts, all on a single floor, with a minimum area of 36 square meters. They are characterized by loggias and terraces that enrich the internal space of the kitchen and living room, while also contributing to the design of the long facade. The bathroom and kitchen are designed with minimal dimensions to prioritize the living rooms and bedrooms, which are designed with equipped walls that contain niches, shelves, wardrobes, allowing for a greater availability of useful surface area for living in the house. Care and attention was given to the articulation of the facades, elaborately designed in relationship to their facing onto the street, as a place of interaction between the collective building and the public space for city relations. The south front of the complex is defined by low-rise, two-story balcony buildings inserted into the high-rise blocks perpendicular to the street and characterized by rhythmic alternation of solids and voids created by the deep recesses of the loggia. The ground floor of this section is set back slightly and dedicated to commercial activities. The north facades feature a system of columns that support the upper floors, defined by the transparent and aerial appearance of the loggias. Some low enclosed buildings intersect with the facade parallel to the street, set back and detached from the vertical supporting elements. This arrangement, repeated for each linear block, evokes somehow a sort of portico streetscape along the main northern street of the settlement. Moving from modern movement to more recent times, when the architectural theories and projects tended to question and challenge the modernist dogmas represented by the previous case study, we can recognize some of these themes and architectural types in projects carried out by Italian architects for the realization of residential fragments of urban context. In Aldo Rossi, a Galaratese project, the architectural archetype, the portico, the typical Milanese corridor hallway, the square window, a reaction to the ribbon window, and the pitched roof, opposed to the modernist flat roof, and the modernist linear block type, the Siedlung, the Unité d'Habitation, are infused with the workings, assemblage, compositions of familiar and recognizable figures and elements. Here, invention becomes etymologically an opportunity to find and rediscover, to create, within the architectural context designed by Carlo Amoinino, the variety and complexity that represents a fundamental characteristic of the traditional city. Before Rossi, another Milanese architect well represents the continuity between the lesson of the ancient masters and the reinvention of modernity in order to build the architecture in the city. Ignazio Gardella, as already pointed out, was one of the architects that in the late 1930s designed the Milano Verde proposal for Milan, a project that can be read as an expression of the modern movement, urban planning, that has its roots in the history of Greek and Roman cities. The project was also developed at the architectural scale, not in detail, but with a clear idea on how the building should have been designed in terms of massing, volumes, and facade solution. One of these is a linear residential block with a glass curtain wall protected by a 3-story height portico with columns and balconies overlooking a green area. I see this schematic project as a sort of diagrammatic version and a fragment of a Greek stoa or of a Roman forum. As we know, the Milano Verde plan was not developed or even realized, but this fragment took shape in the late 40s in Milan in front of Parco Sempione, when Ignazio Gardella designed and built the Tognella house, also called the house in the park. The main protagonist of the building is its facade. Designed as a monumental frame of columns and slabs, as a vertical composition of hanging porticos, which recalls the giant order of classical architecture in a sort of reinterpretation of Palladio's Palazzo Chiericati in Vicenza, whose origins are clearly related to the Greek and Roman archetypes. In fact, as Raphael Moneo points out, Gardella's contribution to architecture is to, quote, insert on the structure of modern architecture the principles and criteria established in Renaissance and effective for centuries, end of quote, in a perfect balance of tradition and invention, of memory and innovation, with the purpose of celebrating the traces of stratification of history in the city. The building has 5 floors with 1 big apartment each. The plan is divided into 3 rectangular spaces running parallel to the street, as in Palazzo Chiericati. The one that contains the bedrooms and the services as a conventional layout of closed rooms and equipped hallway, with an exterior envelope made of solid opaque walls cut by vertical openings. The central part contains the staircase, elevators, and hallways. The part facing the park is an open space where the dining room, living room, and studio flow one into the other, open to a balcony that runs across the whole facade. The contrast with the opaque volume behind it is evident, and being slightly shorter, it appears to be a detached and independent component of the building. Behind the frame of columns, Gardella designs the envelope that enclosed the interior as a broken line made of thin, solid panels, but mostly of big floor-to-ceiling windows, as an asymmetrical free form flowing behind and between the pillars. This is one of the transgressions typical of Gardella's architecture, as Argan calls them, the capacity to take composition beyond the expected and the predictable as a pure act of imagination and invention. Yet, Argan notes, this is not a simplified personal gesture, abstract from reality, but a reaction to light and atmosphere and the actual life inside the building. From the inside, the vertical composition of the pillars frames the view towards the park, which is a consistent presence in the interior, enclosed by the transparent thin wall of windows. This flowing envelope, which sometimes incorporates the pillars into the interior, seems to extend and contract under the vital pushes of the interior and as a reaction to the outside. As in Palazzo Chiericati, in the Toniella house, the play of light and shadow contributes to the perception of the thickness of the facade from the outside and clearly shows the tension between the classical rigidity of the pillars and the gracious and sculptural arrangement of the thin wall behind them. Since in front of the building there is an open space and a huge park, this chiaroscuro play helps to give visual strength to the building, also when seen from the distance. This is the result of the fertile and balanced tension between memory and invention, and a tribute to how architecture and the city were built in ancient times. Thank you.